Thank you. Good morning. So we heard this session opened with, it's essential to get the plumbing right. And you also heard Professor Thayer make reference to, I think it was mucky details and even sludge. So fine, I'm the plumber. I'm glad to be here. Obviously, we don't get out too much, so I'm glad to be here. We've been working on this for some time. My comments this morning, I work for ADP, but I also serve as president of the National Payroll Reporting Consortium. It's a nonprofit trade association of the largest 12 or so payroll service companies in the nation, through which about 1/3 of the private sector workforce is paid. It's very routine for us to handle all employer withholding and remittances, and just pretty much hands off for employers for this sort of thing. So it's right in our wheelhouse, which is good news. I do want to say that we have to be neutral on all policy matters, such as whether these programs are necessary. I will say, on a personal note, I am highly sympathetic. I think if you don't have payroll withholding, it's absolutely essential to retirement security. You just got to have that. That's a component that, that makes or breaks. So. I will mention over the past, in fact, this was invited in part by, Courtney and others in Illinois who suggested that we get together and start talking about some of the mechanics and how is this going to work and what are the problems and how do we get it right. So we have evolved a group of, maybe half a dozen states, several payroll service companies, a number of associations representing payroll providers, employer associations, including the American Payroll Association, research and advocacy organizations. It's come to be a group of like 48, almost 50 people that get on calls periodically, meet periodically, and talk about, what are the problems going to be here. How can we minimize the employer administrative burden? And I do want to say, Illinois is going to set some precedents here, so it's obviously a very important question. And I would say it's actually existential. Like, if you don't get this right, this program's not going to work. It's not going to be feasible. And it's not clear to me that you'll actually make this work. It's going to be a challenge. So you've done a lot of groundbreaking work already. You're going to need to continue to do groundbreaking work and do some things that have never been done before to make sure that these costs are as minimal as possible, for employees, record keepers, employers. Critical. So we just recently broke up into a number of different work groups. These are the three best practices, definitions, and communications and protocols. I just wanted to take you through a couple of points of, examples of what the sort of issues are that we're working on. In a nutshell, I do want to say, people ask me on the break, just how hard is this going to be if you have a payroll service? It's easy. If you have a payroll service, deductions are a breeze. We handle the actual remittance and the reporting for you. There's really not much for employers to do. What's new, what's different here is enrollments, auto-enrollment, and obviously that's done in the 401k space, but it's not generally done, especially on the lower end. Smaller businesses don't generally do that. You're dealing with populations that you've never dealt with before. That's going to be probably your biggest problem. These are folks that are going to need a lot of attention and a lot of support, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of in-person, phone time, very, very costly folks to service. So definitions are critical for employer administration. And the goal is really, you need to be able to get to a point where you tell employers, this program is, it's exactly like unemployment insurance, or it's exactly like your income tax withholding responsibilities. Employers are going to want to know, who's the subject employer, which employees do I have to include, which wages should I withhold from? There's different wages that are exempted from income tax, but not from other things. So a lot of those questions, if you can't boil it down to it's just like something else, there's going to be a problem. You're going to need to do a lot of education and training, and you'll have the 50 additional pages of reporting that employers are going to have to do. Got to get to that point. Consistent employers in particular, Over time, we'll see a number of different states. A number of states have already enacted legislation. They're moving down this path as well. If the laws are not pretty much the same, if they're not consistent, your laws will cover the same people in different states at the same time. All right, so that gives employers a little bit of pause and like, okay, so which one do I pay attention to? Things like that. And these are not problems that are unresolvable. We have to make recommendations. You'll probably need to adopt some rules on here's how you handle if somebody comes in and works in Illinois. They can be here for 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months. How long can you be in the state? What do you do about residents who are working in other states, and maybe the other state doesn't have a retirement plan law, and so you have an Illinois resident that isn't covered. Is that acceptable, or do you really want to have, anyway, so definitions matter. So that's part of what we're going to get into, part of what we're going to talk about, make recommendations on. Employers are also concerned about, and especially large employers, they generally offer plans anyway, but even they are concerned that okay, I don't cover every last person. And so is the state going to come to me and say, well, yeah, you're exempt generally, but I noticed, you didn't cover the part-time folks, the contingent workers, all these different populations, and they deserve a retirement as well. So it's a valid point. What do you do with that? And employers are concerned that, well, they're not really going to be exempted because they're going to be forced into this. And, good news is that the result is going to be that employers will naturally cover those people that, you would like to have them covered anyway. So, but, it's going to be, we'll need to think about that. How's that going to work? Employers are concerned about, well, what if the state comes in and they say, well, yeah, you sort of are exempt, but, we don't like your plan because the fees are very high, or, you're not doing this or that or the other thing. And so therefore you have to be in the state plan, and employers are they usually love to rely on ERISA to help them avoid state by state variations like that. So again, just we don't have a whole lot of time to get into these details, but again, automatic enrollment systems, another kind of key area. But basically, there are some new functions that we'll have to figure out here. Payments, remittances, reporting, not a big deal. Exactly how will employers report, here's my roster of employees, and exactly how are they going to get something back from record keepers saying, okay, fine, got your roster, go ahead and start withholding. There's going to be a certain percentage that fall out. And they say, well, I don't have a match on these guys. The name, the social security number doesn't match the financial institution database. You can't start withholding on these guys. So how difficult is that going to be, especially for small businesses? If you're going to be reaching out to small businesses and saying, all right, for Joe, go ahead and start withholding this week, but don't do it for Marcia, there's a problem. If you get to that level, that's really, really going to be tough. Customer identification requirements. We've made some progress here recently. Legal opinion in California said you don't need signatures if the employer gives good information, good identifying information. Error resolution, again, this is sort of the nitty sludge detail that we talked about early in the day. But what exactly happens when the name and social security number doesn't match? Who gets involved? How do you resolve that? Is very, very big. And the reality is that you're a little bit ahead of what should have come before, which is immigration reform. So you don't have a good handle on every last worker in the U.S. doesn't necessarily have good identification information, and what do you do with them? So adjustments, late opt-outs, with that kind of thing. Contributions being volatile, earnings are volatile. Where I was talking to somebody earlier this morning about how predictable are earnings, and we looked at the UK Nest program and their payroll administration guide, and it was horrifying. I got to say, because they seem to want to know in great detail, what to expect in terms of earnings and contributions from time to time for every employee, which is really, really difficult to do. The reality is that earnings are highly, highly volatile, and you should build your system to expect that you might not get any deductions whatsoever for some time. They'll skip some. It'll be less than you thought. Just, plan accordingly. And lastly, record-keeping authorizations. Martin mentioned earlier, absolutely everything must be electronic. That doesn't mean every employee has to get their notices electronically, but every employer has to be able to administer the notices electronically if they prefer. So we got to come up with rules and some approach that doesn't leave people out, not having gotten these notices and disclosures. But it's got to be very efficient. It's got to be, literally everything you do has to be at least an electronic option. Languages and accessibility is another thing that really scares employers. A lot of the Labor Department requirements that are coming out with new disclosures lately are saying you've got to, support these new disclosures in 8 languages. Usually the state drafts those disclosures in the different languages, but it's still, it's something to administer, something to think about. And you don't want to leave people, out in the cold. They didn't get the disclosure, it didn't reach them because they don't understand English very well. So we'll be looking at that, making recommendations on how do you do that exactly, while remaining efficient but effective. And my last point, self-service has to be compelling, not just, good. It's got to be better than what's out there today. So this is, again, another point where, you've got to continue doing groundbreaking work. Your the electronification, everything's got to be electronic. You're going to do some things that haven't been done before to get there. To be better than what's out there today. It's going to be very good. So I'm going to close there. Glad to be here for questions. And again, thanks for inviting me.